She was already losing interest before you finished your first sentence. Not because you said something wrong, because you asked something weak. You asked her name. You asked what she does. You asked where she's from. And with every question, you watched something shift behind her eyes, a dimming, a distance, a door closing that you didn't even know was open. You thought you were building connection. You were building your own rejection. Here's what nobody taught you. Questions are not conversation. Questions are confession. Every time you ask a woman something about herself, you're telling her something about yourself. You're telling her you need information she hasn't offered. You're telling her you're trying to qualify. You're telling her you don't yet know if she's worth your attention. But you're already giving it away, hoping she'll prove herself. That's not how powerful men communicate. That's how applicants interview. Machiavelli understood something about human nature that modern men have completely forgotten. In The Prince, he wrote that men judge more by the eye than by the hand. They see what appears, but they rarely touch what is. Most men talk to women as if words are the goal. They're not. Perception is the goal. And perception is shaped not by what you say, but by how your presence makes her feel before you say anything. Today, I'm going to teach you how to talk to women without asking questions. Not because questions are always wrong, but because most men use questions as a crutch, a way to fill silence, a way to seem interested, a way to avoid the discomfort of actually leading a conversation. When you stop asking and start stating, something shifts. You become the one with perspective. You become the one who observes rather than investigates. You become the man who already seems to understand her, even though you've just met. And that perception, that sense that you see something others miss, creates the exact psychological tension that triggers attraction. Robert Greene called this the art of strategic absence. Not absence of body, absence of neediness. The man who doesn't need to ask is the man who appears to already know. And knowledge, especially knowledge of her, is irresistible. Let me show you what happens when men get this wrong. He approaches her at a social event. She's standing with a drink, observing the room. He walks up, nervous energy barely hidden, and says, "Hey, I'm Mike. What's your name?" She tells him. "Cool. So what do you do?" She answers briefly. "Oh, nice. Do you like it?" She shrugs. "So, where are you from originally?" By now, her body has angled away. Her answers have shortened. Her eyes are scanning for escape routes. He thinks he's making conversation. He's making a mistake. Every question handed her the frame. Every question positioned him as the one who needed to learn, and her as the one who decided what to reveal. The power imbalance was established in the first 15 seconds, and everything after was just confirmation. Now watch what happens when a man understands the principle. He approaches the same woman in the same situation. He stands beside her, looks at what she's observing, and says, "You're not really here. You're watching everyone else trying too hard." She turns. She laughs. Is it that obvious? He smiles slightly. Only to someone doing the same thing. No questions, just observations. And in that single exchange, something happened that took the first man 5 questions to destroy. She became curious about him. Schopenhauer wrote that the first 40 years of life give us the text, and the next 30 supply the commentary. Most men try to extract someone's text through questions. The intelligent man offers commentary first, and the text reveals itself. This video will teach you 7 principles for talking to women without asking questions. Not tricks, not lines. Principles that reshape how you communicate entirely. By the end, you'll understand that questions aren't bad because they're questions. They're bad because of what they reveal about the man asking them. The first principle is the foundation. Get this wrong, and nothing else works. Principle 1. Statements create status. Here's the truth most men will never accept. The person asking questions is always lower status than the person answering them. Think about every high-stakes situation you've been in. Job interviews. You asked questions. They decided your fate. Police interrogations. They ask, you answer, they hold power. First dates where you felt nervous. You asked question after question, and she grew more distant with each one. Now think about conversations where you felt powerful. A friend asking your advice. A colleague seeking your perspective. Someone genuinely curious about your experience. You weren't asking. You were stating. You were sharing. You were the one with something to offer. This isn't coincidence. It's psychology. Daniel Kahneman's research on cognitive load shows that the brain processes statements and questions completely differently. Questions create obligation. The receiver must search memory, formulate response, then deliver. Statements create interpretation. The receiver evaluates, considers, then decides how to engage. One position is reactive, the other is selective. One is subordinate, the other is sovereign. When you make statements to a woman instead of asking questions, you accomplish several things simultaneously. First, you establish that you have perspectives worth hearing. Second, you remove the interview dynamic that kills attraction. Third, you give her something to react to rather than something to answer. And reaction is where genuine personality emerges. Let me give you concrete examples because theory without application is useless. Instead of, "What do you do for work?" you say, "You seem like someone who gets bored easily. I bet your job has to challenge you or you check out." Now she has something to confirm, deny, or elaborate on. She's responding to your perception, not filling out your questionnaire. Instead of, "Where are you from?" you say, "You're definitely not from here. There's something about the way you carry yourself." She's now curious what you noticed. She might correct you. She might ask what you mean. Either way, she's engaged with your observation rather than providing data. Instead of, "Do you come here often?" which is possibly the weakest question in history, you say, "This isn't your usual spot. You look like you're studying everyone." She laughs, or pushes back, or asks how you could tell. The conversation is alive. Robert Greene wrote in The Art of Seduction that the greatest seducers in history never asked for anything directly. They created situations where the target offered willingly. Questions beg for response. Statements invite reaction. The difference is everything. But here's where most men fail when they first try this. They make statements that are either too generic or too aggressive. "You seem nice" is meaningless. "You seem like you have daddy issues" is offensive. The art is in observational precision. You notice something specific, something that suggests you're actually paying attention, and you frame it as insight rather than inquiry. This requires something most men never develop: actual observation. Most men are so busy planning their next question that they don't actually see the woman in front of them. Her posture, her expressions, how she holds her drink, whether she's truly comfortable or performing comfort, what she looks at when she thinks no one is watching. Carl Jung called this individuation observation, the ability to see the particular rather than the general. Most men look at a woman and see attractive female. The man who can speak in statements sees specifics, and specifics make statements land. Here's the practice. For 1 week, never ask a woman a direct question about herself. Not one. Instead, make observations and let her fill in the details. You'll notice 2 things immediately. First, conversations become more interesting because she's revealing what she wants to reveal. not what you demanded. Second, attraction increases because you've stopped interviewing and started engaging. Now, there's an objection forming in your mind. What if my observation is wrong? Good. Being wrong is often better than being right. When you observe something incorrectly, she corrects you with enthusiasm. She wants to explain who she actually is. She invests in making sure you understand her accurately. And investment is the foundation of attraction. Machiavelli understood that errors can be strategic. He wrote that sometimes a prince must deliberately appear to misjudge, so that when he acts wisely, the contrast amplifies his perceived intelligence. In conversation, a wrong observation that gets corrected is often more engaging than a right observation that gets confirmed. The principle is this: statements create status because they demonstrate that you have a perspective worth expressing. Questions surrender status because they admit you need information the other person controls. Master this single shift, and every conversation you have will feel different. But statements alone aren't enough. What you state matters. And that brings us to the second principle. Principle 2, observe the hidden, not the obvious. Most men, when they try to make statements instead of questions, make a critical error. They state the obvious. You have beautiful eyes. That dress looks great on you. You seem really confident. These are statements. They're also worthless, because obvious observations don't demonstrate perception. They demonstrate the bare minimum of functional vision. When you tell a woman something she already knows about herself, something everyone sees, you've just proven you're like everyone else. You noticed what couldn't be missed. That's not insight. That's attendance. Robert Greene called this the error of surface reading. Most people see faces, clothes, social presentations. Few people see through to the contradictions, the tensions, the things a person is trying to hide or doesn't know they're revealing. And it's those hidden observations that create psychological impact. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. A woman at a bar is smiling, laughing, seems completely at ease. The obvious observation, you're having a great time. The hidden observation, you're performing right now. The smile is real, but you're not fully here. Something's on your mind. If you're right, she's stunned. She feels seen in a way that's slightly uncomfortable, but deeply compelling. If you're wrong, she tells you so. But she's intrigued that you looked beneath the surface. Either way, you've demonstrated something rare, the ability to see what others miss. Nietzsche wrote extensively about masks. He believed every person wears multiple masks, and that the most interesting human interactions occur when someone recognizes the mask without demanding its removal. Most men try to remove masks through questions. What are you really thinking? How do you actually feel? These questions create defensiveness. The man who simply observes the mask, who comments on it without accusation, creates something different. Trust mixed with tension. She realizes you see more than she shows, but you're not weaponizing it. You're not exposing her. You're just acknowledging that depth exists. Here are categories of hidden observations that consistently land. Category 1, contradictions. She says she's spontaneous, but you notice she checks her phone at predictable intervals. She presents as carefree, but her posture is controlled, calculated. She claims she doesn't care what people think, but she adjusted her hair twice when a specific group walked past. Contradictions reveal the gap between performed identity and actual psychology. Noticing them shows dangerous perception. Category 2, effort. Where is she trying? Where has she stopped trying? Her makeup is precise, but her shoes are practical. She's dressed to impress from the waist up, but comfortable from the waist down. She's here for attention, but not for action. This observation tells her you read strategy, not just appearance. Category 3. Protection. What is she guarding? Defensive body language around certain topics. Quick subject changes when conversation moves toward particular areas. Excessive emphasis on things she claims not to care about. Noticing protection without probing it creates a strange intimacy. You saw the wall without trying to climb it. Jung would call these shadow observations. Every person has a shadow, the parts of themselves they repress, deny, or hide. Most social interaction occurs entirely in the persona, the constructed self. When you observe shadow elements without judgment, you enter psychological territory most men never access. Now here's the technique. You don't state hidden observations directly like accusations. You frame them as interpretations, gentle but confident. Not, "You're faking being happy." Instead, "There's something going on behind that smile. You don't have to tell me what it is." Not, "You obviously have trust issues." Instead, "You keep people at exactly the distance you can control. I wonder when that started." Not, "You're insecure about your intelligence." Instead, "You're smarter than you let people see. You downplay it on purpose." The frame matters as much as the observation. You're not attacking, you're recognizing. And recognition, when it's accurate, creates a connection that superficial compliments never can. Freud believed that the unconscious constantly signals through small behaviors, and that most people never notice these signals because they're too focused on conscious communication. The man who reads unconscious signals operates on a different level. He seems almost psychic. In reality, he's just paying attention to what everyone else ignores. Here's the warning. This power must be used carefully. Hidden observations can feel invasive if delivered wrong. The goal is never to make her feel exposed or vulnerable in a threatening way. The goal is to make her feel seen in a way that's both uncomfortable and exciting. The discomfort is crucial. It's the tension that creates attraction. But it must be paired with enough warmth that she feels safe inside the tension. Machiavelli wrote about this balance constantly. A prince must be feared enough to maintain respect, but not so feared that he creates enemies who plot his destruction. In conversation, you must observe enough to create intrigue, but not so much that you create defensiveness. The principle: observe the hidden, not the obvious. Because obvious observations prove you have eyes. Hidden observations prove you have insight. And insight is what separates forgettable conversations from unforgettable ones. The next principle takes this further. Once you see beneath the surface, you must know how to speak to what you find. Principle 3. Speak to her shadow, not her persona. Every woman you meet is presenting a performance, not because she's fake, because that's what social life requires. We all perform versions of ourselves depending on context. But here's what most men don't realize. The performance isn't who she wants to be seen as. It's who she thinks she has to be. Beneath every persona lies the shadow. The parts of herself she suppresses because they're not appropriate, not acceptable, not safe to show. The adventurous impulse she calls reckless. The ambitious drive she downplays to seem agreeable. The desire for intensity that she masks with casual indifference. These shadow elements don't disappear. They wait. And the man who speaks to them directly creates a reaction that polite conversation never produces. Carl Jung believed the shadow contains not just negative repressed content, but also positive qualities that were deemed unacceptable by family, culture, or circumstance. A woman raised to be modest may have suppressed genuine confidence. A woman praised only for appearance may have buried intellectual ambition. A woman taught that desire is shameful may have caged a passionate nature. When you speak to the shadow, You're addressing the self she wishes she could be, but rarely has permission to show. Let me make this concrete. She tells you she works in accounting. Most men say, "Oh, that sounds stable," or ask boring follow-up questions about numbers and spreadsheets. But you notice something, a restlessness in how she described it, a slight dismissal in her tone. So you say, "You took the safe path, but you think about the risky one. Probably more than you admit." You just spoke to her shadow, the part of her that wanted something else, the part she quieted to be responsible. She may confirm it, deny it, or ask how you knew. But she's now engaged at a level that accounting conversation never reaches. Another example. She presents as very put together. Perfect appearance, controlled responses, measured social presence. You say, "You've spent a lot of energy becoming this, but I wonder what you were like before you decided to be so composed." That question, or rather that statement, opens a door to whoever she was before the performance became permanent. Maybe a messier person, a more chaotic person, a version of herself she misses. You gave her permission to remember that person by acknowledging she exists. Nietzsche wrote about the Dionysian impulse, the drive toward chaos, passion, dissolution of boundaries. Society demands the Apollonian, order, structure, control. Most women have been trained since childhood to suppress the Dionysian. When you speak to it, you speak to something that rarely gets addressed, and what rarely gets addressed becomes magnetic when finally acknowledged. Here's why this works psychologically. Freud identified that repressed content creates pressure. The shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It builds. When someone finally sees it, finally names it without judgment, the relief is intense. It feels like being understood at a level that normal conversation never reaches. But here's the critical technique. You must speak to the shadow without dragging it into full light. You're not her therapist. You're not demanding she confront her repressed content. You're acknowledging it exists and then letting it be. The difference between powerful and invasive is this. The powerful statement opens a door. The invasive statement pushes her through it. Not, "Tell me about your shadow self." Instead, "There's a version of you that's wilder than this. She probably comes out when no one's watching." Not, "What are you hiding?" Instead, "I don't know what you're not saying, but it's probably more interesting than what you are." Schopenhauer believed that all communication is incomplete, because language can never fully capture inner experience. The man who acknowledges this incompleteness, who speaks to what can't be said directly, demonstrates a philosophical sophistication that creates trust. Here's a practical application. When she tells you something about herself, anything, ask yourself, what's the shadow of this? What's the opposite of what she's presenting? What's the suppressed element? She says she values stability. Shadow, craving for disruption. She says she's an open book. Shadow, something she never tells anyone. She says she doesn't need anyone. Shadow, specific wound that made her say that. She says she's happy with her life. Shadow, the life she imagined but didn't pursue. When you speak to shadows, you speak to depth. And depth is attractive because it's rare. Most conversations stay entirely on the surface. Most men never venture beyond small talk. The man who can speak to what lies beneath becomes the only interesting person she's talked to all week. Machiavelli knew that the most effective influence occurs when people feel you understand something about them that others do not. He wrote that a prince who knows the true nature of his subjects, their secret desires and fears, can lead them with precision. In attraction, knowing her true nature, not demanding she reveal it, but simply demonstrating that you see it, creates a bond that surface connection never can. The principle, Speak to her shadow, not her persona. Because the persona is what she shows everyone. The shadow is what she wishes someone would finally see. Now, we need to discuss what holds all of this together. The quality that makes statements land, observations penetrate, and shadow recognition feels safe rather than threatening. Principle 4. 4. Tonality carries more than words. Everything you've learned so far can fail completely if delivered with the wrong energy. The most insightful observation becomes creepy if said with nervous intensity. The most powerful statement becomes try hard if delivered with desperation. This is where most men sabotage themselves. They learn what to say, but never learn how to say it. Machiavelli understood that presentation often matters more than substance. He wrote that the common people are always deceived by appearances and by the outcome of events. In conversation, this means your tonality, your pacing, your physical composure all shape how your words land. There are 3 tonal registers that create the right perception. The first is measured certainty, not loud certainty, not aggressive certainty. The quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need you to agree but knows they're right anyway. When you make an observation about her, it's delivered as fact, not as question-seeking validation. You are not as carefree as you pretend. Lands differently when said with calm conviction versus nervous speculation. The second register is warm indifference. You care enough to observe. You don't care enough to need a particular response. This paradox creates tension because she can't figure out if she's got you or not. Your warmth invites, your indifference challenges. Together, they create magnetic uncertainty. The third register is controlled depth. When you speak to shadows, your voice should lower slightly, slow slightly. Create the sense that you're sharing something significant, not performing something clever. Depth requires vocal weight. Fast, high-pitched delivery undermines the most profound insight. Robert Greene wrote about what he called the seductive rhythm. Master seducers don't just choose words. They choose tempo. They know when to accelerate, creating excitement. When to slow, creating tension. When to pause, creating anticipation. Most men speak at one speed, one tone, one intensity. Monotony is the enemy of engagement. Here's the practice. Record yourself speaking for 2 minutes about any topic. Listen back. Notice where your voice becomes predictable, where you speed up from nervousness, where your tone stays flat. Then, deliberately practice variation. This feels awkward at first. Eventually, it becomes your natural range. Principle 5. Silence as strategic tool. We've talked about not asking questions. Now we need to talk about what replaces the space questions used to fill. Silence. Most men fear silence in conversation because it feels like failure. The conversation is dying. Interest is fading. They must save it with words. This instinct destroys more attraction than any single mistake. Silence after a statement amplifies its power. You make an observation. She responds. Instead of immediately following up, you let her words hang. You hold eye contact. You allow the moment to breathe. That silence tells her, I don't need to fill space. I'm comfortable with tension. I'm not performing for your entertainment. Nietzsche believed that the most significant communication occurs in what remains unsaid. He wrote that every philosophy conceals another philosophy, and every opinion also a hiding place. The man who talks constantly hides behind noise. The man who embraces silence reveals comfort with himself. Here's the psychology. Silence creates cognitive pressure. The brain doesn't like open loops. When you pause after an exchange, Her mind continues processing. She wonders what you're thinking. She may fill the silence herself, often revealing more than she intended. She experiences you as mysterious simply because you're not desperately filling every second. There are two types of strategic silence. Reflective silence comes after she says something meaningful. Instead of immediately responding, you pause, as if genuinely considering her words. This communicates that what she said matters enough to think about. Most men respond instantly, signaling that they were barely listening, just waiting for their turn to speak. Charged silence comes after you say something meaningful. You make an observation about her shadow. You watch her reaction. You don't explain, justify, or soften. You let it land. This silence forces her to process without your help. It demonstrates that you don't need to manage her response. Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called the discipline of assent, the conscious choice not to immediately react to every stimulus. In conversation, this means building the muscle of pause. When you feel the urge to fill silence, notice that urge. Don't act on it. Let the discomfort exist for 3 seconds longer than feels comfortable. Here's what happens when you master strategic silence. Conversations become shorter, but more impactful. You say less, but what you say lands harder. She remembers your words because they weren't diluted by nervous chatter. And she perceives you as powerful simply because you're not desperately trying to seem powerful. Machiavelli would recognize this as the principle of strategic restraint. He wrote that the wise prince never shows all his forces. He holds reserves. In conversation, your reserves are the things you don't say, the observations you make mentally but keep silent, the responses you withhold because they would add nothing. The principle, silence isn't the absence of conversation. It's the presence of control. The man who can hold silence comfortably will always command more respect than the man who fills every gap with words. Principle 6. Lead through frames, not facts. Every conversation has a frame. The frame determines what role each person plays. In most conversations between men and women, the man unknowingly accepts the frame she sets. He asks questions, she evaluates, he shares, she judges, he performs, she scores. This is the default frame, and it destroys attraction because it positions her as the prize. The man who talks without asking questions is already disrupting the default frame. But disruption isn't enough. You must actively establish a new frame where you are the one evaluating. She is the one revealing. And her response to you matters more than your response to her. Robert Greene called this frame control, the foundational skill of power. Whoever sets the frame of an interaction controls its outcome. Most men enter interactions thinking, "How can I impress her?" That frame guarantees failure because it presupposes her value exceeds yours. Here's how you establish frame through statements, not questions. Instead of trying to impress, "I'm not sure about you yet. You seem interesting, but I haven't decided." This flips the evaluation. Now she's wondering what would make you decide. She's qualifying to you. Instead of seeking her approval, "I don't know if we'd get along. You seem like you're either great or exhausting. Nothing in between." This establishes that you're the one assessing compatibility, not hoping for it. Instead of showing interest directly, "There's something about you I'm trying to figure out. I'll let you know when I crack it." This positions you as the one solving a puzzle, her as the puzzle being solved. Nietzsche wrote about the master-slave dynamic in human relationships. One person operates from a position of creating value, the other from seeking value already created. The man who frames conversations correctly operates from the master position, not through cruelty, but through self-possession. His value doesn't require her validation. Here's a critical technique. Never let her establish the frame through a question she asks you. When she asks, "So what do you do?" don't just answer. Reframe before responding. That's such a boring question. But since you asked, I'll tell you the interesting version. Now you've commented on her frame, established yours, and only then provided content. Schopenhauer understood that most people surrender frame without realizing it. They simply respond to whatever direction conversation takes. The rare individual who consciously shapes conversation's direction appears magnetic, even when they're doing nothing overtly impressive. Their power lies in quiet control of the interaction's architecture. Principle 7. Create investment through incomplete loops. Here's the final principle that ties everything together. The human brain cannot stand incomplete patterns. When a story begins but doesn't end, when a statement implies more than it says, when an observation opens a door but doesn't walk through it, the mind becomes obsessed with completion. Daniel Kahneman documented this as the Zeigarnik effect. Incomplete tasks are remembered far better than completed ones. In conversation, this means the man who leaves things unsaid creates more mental real estate than the man who explains everything fully. When you make observations about her shadow, you don't explain them entirely. You open the door and stop. There's something you're protecting. I won't ask what it is. That incomplete loop stays with her. She wonders how you knew. She wonders what you saw. She wonders what would happen if she told you. When you establish a frame, you don't justify it. I'm still deciding about you. Without explaining your criteria, creates an open loop. She now wants to know what would close it. She invests energy in understanding your standards. When you share something about yourself, you don't complete the story. I learned something at 22 that changed everything. But that's a story for another time. Now, she has to see you again to hear the ending. The loop demands closure. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He wrote that the prince must always maintain uncertainty in the minds of subjects and rivals. Certainty breeds contempt. Uncertainty breeds attention. In conversation, full disclosure kills interest. Strategic incompleteness sustains it. Here's how to implement this. For every significant exchange, ask yourself, am I completing this loop or leaving it open? Most men instinctively complete. They answer questions fully. They explain statements exhaustively. They provide closure constantly. This is why they're forgettable. The man who masters incomplete loops becomes unforgettable because he's never fully resolved. Every conversation ends with threads still dangling. Every interaction leaves something undiscovered. She can't stop thinking about him because her brain keeps trying to close loops he intentionally left open. This isn't manipulation. It's understanding human psychology. Freud knew that the unconscious is drawn to incompleteness. Jung knew that psychological tension demands resolution. The man who creates that tension while remaining worthy of the resolution is the man women can't forget. The principle: create investment through incomplete loops. Because completion ends attention, but incompleteness sustains obsession. Let me show you how these 7 principles work together. You approach a woman at an event. You don't open with a question. You make an observation about her position in the room, something that demonstrates you were watching before approaching. You chose the one spot where you can see everyone without anyone noticing you watching. Statement? Not question. You've demonstrated perception immediately. She laughs, maybe denies it, maybe confirms. Doesn't matter. You've started in a frame where you're the observer, not the interviewer. She responds to your statement. You let a small silence hang after her response. You're not rushing to fill. You're comfortable in the pause. When she offers something about herself, you don't follow up with questions. You make an observation about what she said. You talked about your job like you're trying to convince yourself you like it. You've observed the hidden, not the obvious. She either confirms or corrects, but either way, she's now engaged at a level beneath surface chit-chat. Your tonality throughout stays measured, warm but indifferent, certain but not aggressive. You're interested but not invested. You're present but not desperate. This creates tension because she can't quite place you in any familiar category. When you speak to something deeper, her shadow, your voice drops slightly. The pace slows. There's something you want that you don't let yourself want out loud. I'm not going to ask what it is, but I see it. Then silence. You let it land. You don't soften it or explain it. You've demonstrated depth perception while creating an incomplete loop. If she asks you questions, and she will, you don't just answer. You reframe. She asks what you do. That's the first question everyone asks. I'll answer, but tell me first, why does everyone start there? Now she's thinking about her own pattern. You've made her question her question. Then you answer, but incompletely. You leave threads. The conversation doesn't feel like an interview. It feels like a discovery. She's learning about you, but always feels there's more. You're learning about her, but not through interrogation. The frame never positions her as prize. If anything, you're the one evaluating, still deciding, not yet certain. By the end of 15 minutes, something has happened that most men never achieve in 15 hours. She feels genuinely seen, not superficially complimented. Seen. You observed things others miss. You spoke to parts of herself she doesn't show. And you didn't demand anything for it. You didn't push. You didn't pry. You simply demonstrated that you understand. That's Machiavellian communication. Not manipulation. Mastery. The difference is crucial. Manipulation tricks someone into a response they wouldn't naturally have. Mastery creates conditions where their natural response is attraction because you have become genuinely attractive through how you engage. Nietzsche wrote about becoming who you are. Most men try to become what they think women want. The master communicator becomes fully himself and lets that self create its own attraction. Questions are how uncertain men seek information to adjust themselves. Statements are how certain men express themselves and let others adjust. This isn't about becoming a different person. It's about communicating as the person you already are but have been trained to hide. The observations you don't voice because you fear they're too direct. The silences you fill because you fear they're too uncomfortable. The frames you surrender because you fear seeming arrogant. When you stop asking questions, something surprising happens. You start trusting your own perceptions. You stop seeking validation through her answers. You start offering value through your observations. That shift from seeker to provider changes everything about how you're perceived. Jung would say you're integrating your shadow. The parts of you that were deemed too much, too intense, too observant, too different. Those parts emerge when you stop filtering yourself through questions designed to seem normal. The man who stops asking questions starts being himself. And that self, unfiltered, is infinitely more attractive than the performing version who asks all the right questions but never says anything memorable. Here's what I want you to remember as this video ends. Questions aren't inherently wrong. There's a time for them, late in connection, when trust is established, when curiosity is mutual. But as an opening strategy, as a default mode, as a crutch for nervous men who don't know what else to do, questions destroy more attraction than any other single behavior. Statements create status. Observations of the hidden create intrigue. Speaking to shadows creates depth. Tonality carries meaning. Silence amplifies power. Frames determine dynamics. Incomplete loops sustain interest. Master these 7 principles, and you'll never struggle for what to say again. Not because you'll have lines memorized, because you'll understand the psychology beneath all conversation. You'll see that talking to women isn't about getting them to like you. It's about demonstrating that you understand them, that you see what others miss, that your presence adds something their normal conversations lack. Schopenhauer wrote that the cheapest form of pride is national pride because it shows the person has nothing personal to be proud of. The same applies to conversational pride. The cheapest form is having good questions. The richest form is having genuine insight. Stop asking. Start seeing. Stop investigating. Start observing. Stop interviewing. Start leading. The man who talks without asking questions is the man who's already decided his own value. And that decision, communicated through presence, is more attractive than any question could ever reveal. Until next time.